Welcome to Morpheus Stories. This is a place where you don't need to rush, where your body can soften and your mind can rest. Just listen. Sleep will come when it's ready. Sometimes the night feels too long and your thoughts feel too loud. This is a story about a place where time loses its grip and about two people who find each other in the deep silence of a midnight library. There is nothing to solve here, nothing to prove. Here you can simply exist. Let this story surround you like a warm blanket and remind you, you don't have to carry it all alone. Just listen. The library was not supposed to be open at night. At least, that was what most people believed. During the day, it behaved like any other library, quiet, orderly, predictable. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust floated lazily in the air, and the world outside felt present, pressing faintly against the walls. People came and went with purpose. They borrowed books. They returned them. They whispered and apologized when they whispered too loudly. But at night, the library became something else. Not brighter, not louder. Just deeper. The building stood near the edge of the old part of the city, far enough from traffic that the sounds of cars softened before they reached it. The ocean was not visible from the library, but it could be heard on quiet nights, breathing steadily in the distance. The salt in the air settled gently on the stone steps and the window ledges, as if the sea had decided to leave a trace of itself everywhere. Inside, the lights were dimmed, not off, never off, just low enough to suggest that nothing urgent was expected to happen. Rows of shelves stretched farther than seemed possible, their shadows pooling softly on the floor. The scent of paper, wood, and something faintly mineral lingered in the air, the kind of smell that made breathing feel slower without asking permission. It was after midnight when she arrived. Her footsteps were careful, as if the floor itself were something that could be startled. She paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the half-light. The library accepted her quietly, without question, the way it always did. She had been coming here for weeks, always at night. Her name was Ilya. She did not think of herself as someone with insomnia. That word felt too sharp, too clinical. It implied a problem that needed solving, a malfunction. Ilya did not feel broken. She felt full. Overfilled, maybe, as if her mind had nowhere left to put things. During the day, she functioned well enough. She worked. She answered questions. She completed tasks. She smiled when it was expected. No one would have looked at her and thought something was wrong. But when night came, sleep refused to arrive. Her body would lie still, obedient, heavy beneath the sheets. Her breathing would slow. Her muscles would loosen. And yet her mind remained awake, wandering through unfinished thoughts, replaying fragments of conversations, opening doors that led nowhere, and then standing in the doorway too long. Eventually, she had stopped trying to force sleep. That was when she found the library. Or maybe the library found her. Elia moved deeper inside, her coat folded neatly over one arm. She chose a table near the back where the light was warm and steady, and where the shelves curved slightly inward, creating a sense of enclosure. She set her bag down and sat, resting her palms flat on the wood. Around her, the library breathed. Near the center of the library stood a single tall, antique floor clock. It was older than most of the shelves, its wooden case darkened by time, its glass face softly reflecting the low light of the lamps. Inside, a heavy pendulum moved with slow certainty, marking the passing of time without urgency. The clock was the first thing Ilya had noticed on her very first night here. Before the shelves, before the books, before the feeling that had drawn her back again and again. Its rhythm was impossible to rush. Sitting anywhere in the library meant sitting inside that sound, letting it move through the body, steady and unhurried. It reminded her, without words, that time could exist without pressure, that nothing needed to happen right now. The table was cool beneath her hands. She exhaled. Pages did not turn on their own. Chairs did not creak. The building did not demand attention. It simply existed, holding its silence the way the ocean held water, without effort, without urgency. Elia reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. She did not open it right away. She liked knowing it was there. The option mattered more than the action. She sat like that for a while, letting her thoughts slow naturally, unhooking themselves from one another. That was when she noticed the other woman. She had not heard her enter. There had been no sound of the door, no footsteps announcing her arrival. One moment, Elia was alone in the far section of the library. The next, she wasn't. The woman stood several shelves away, her back turned, one hand resting lightly on the spines of the books, as if she were steadying herself rather than searching for anything specific. She moved slowly, deliberately. There was something unhurried about her presence, something that felt compatible with the night rather than disruptive to it. Elia did not stare. She had learned long ago how to notice without intruding. Still, her attention lingered. The woman wore a simple sweater, soft and slightly oversized, the kind of clothing chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping at the temples. She looked settled, not tired exactly, but grounded, as if she knew where she was meant to be. Eventually, the woman selected a book and turned. Their eyes met. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no jolt, no spark that demanded interpretation, just a brief meeting of gazes in the dim light. The woman smiled, not widely, not performatively, just enough to acknowledge shared space. Elia felt something in her chest loosen. The woman walked toward the central desk near the back of the library, moving with quiet familiarity. She set the book down, adjusted the lamp, and sat. Only then did Elia realize what that meant. She wasn't a visitor. She worked here. The knowledge settled gently, like a book placed back on a shelf. Elia returned her attention to the table, to the smooth grain of the wood, to the steady glow of the light. She did not need to do anything with the information. It was enough to know. Time passed. The library existed in its own rhythm at night. Minutes stretched and folded into one another. Somewhere, a clock marked the hour softly, but it did not insist on being heard. Elia eventually opened her notebook. She did not write much, just a few lines. Observations, fragments, things she didn't want to carry alone. When she closed the notebook again, she noticed a cup placed near the edge of her table. She looked up, surprised. The woman from the desk stood there holding a tray with 2 mugs. Steam rose faintly from both. "I hope this is okay," the woman said quietly. Her voice was low, calm, as if it had been shaped by the night itself. Elia blinked once, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." "It's chamomile," the woman added. "No caffeine." Elia wrapped her hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into her palms almost immediately. "I'm Nora," the woman said, not sitting yet, not rushing. "Elia." Nora smiled again, softer this time. "You're here often." Elia hesitated, then nodded. "It's easier here." Nora seemed to understand without needing further explanation. She pulled out the chair opposite Elia and sat, placing her own mug carefully on the table. The silence between them was not empty. It felt shared. Outside, the night continued to unfold at its own pace. Inside the library, 2 women sat across from each other, steam rising between them, surrounded by stories that had learned how to wait. And for the first time in days, Elia felt something unfamiliar settle into her body. Not sleep, but the quiet possibility of it. The library changed at night, but not in a way that could be pointed at and named. It wasn't only the light, though the lamps were softer after closing. Their glow reduced to warm pools on the wooden carpet. It wasn't only the silence either, because the library was never truly silent, not if someone listened with the patience the place seemed to require. At night, the building simply stopped pretending to be efficient. During the day, it existed for people, Schedules, lists, returns, reminders, transactions. At night, it existed for itself, for paper and dust, for slow air, for the way the shelves held the weight of thousands of stories without straining. Elia began to recognize this difference the way she recognized a familiar scent, not with her mind, with her body. She arrived later than usual, the city outside damp and subdued. The streets were slick with recent rain, and the air carried a faint mineral chill that settled into her collarbones. She had walked without music, without messages, without anything that demanded response. By the time she reached the library steps, her shoulders had already lowered a little, as if the building's presence could reach her through the stone. Inside, the warmth met her gently, not heat, nothing dramatic, just the kind of steady temperature that suggested the building knew how to take care of itself. The entrance hall was dim, and the first sound she noticed was not the outside world, fading behind her, but the inside world continuing without her. A low hum from somewhere above, the muted whisper of an old ventilation system, a slow creak as the building settled into its own bones. Somewhere farther back, paper shifted, one page, carefully turned. Elia didn't rush. She removed her coat and folded it over her arm, her fingers lingering for a moment on the fabric as if confirming it was real. She slid her bag strap higher on her shoulder and walked deeper into the stacks. The library had different kinds of quiet. There was the quiet near the front desk, where someone might step in at any moment and remember they were not alone. There was the quiet near the wide windows, where the night pressed close against the glass and made even a lamp feel intimate. And there was the quiet deeper inside, where the shelves curved in long arcs and the carpet dulled every footstep until movement felt like a private thing. Elia chose that last quiet. She selected a table near a corner that wasn't really a corner, just a place where a tall shelf turned slightly and created a small pocket of space. The lamp there had a soft shade, the kind that made light look like honey. She set her bag down carefully, as if there were something fragile inside, and sat. The chair gave a small sound of protest and then accepted her weight. She exhaled. For a moment, she did nothing else. No notebook, no phone, no planning. Her palms rested flat on the table, feeling the faint texture in the wood grain. There were nights when she could name what kept her awake. A sentence she should not have said. A decision she had postponed. An ache she had tried to ignore. Tonight was not one of those nights. Tonight, the restlessness had no sharp edge. It was simply there, a low agitation moving through her like water that didn't know where to settle. She sat with it, letting the library hold the shape of her body, while her mind gradually stopped trying to solve itself. Only then did she notice Nora. Not because Nora announced herself, not because Nora drew attention, because the air was different when Nora was present. It was subtle, something about the room feeling watched over, not watched. Nora sat at the back desk, her posture relaxed, a book open beside a small stack of papers. The lamp near her cast a warm halo on her hands. She wasn't reading so much as existing near the book, her fingers resting lightly on the page, as though she liked knowing it was there. She looked up when Elia settled into her chair. Their eyes met. Nora's expression shifted into something soft and quiet, a recognition that carried no requirement. Elia felt her throat loosen, as if she had been holding something without realizing. Nora returned to her papers. Elia returned to her table. Time moved the way it moved here, slowly, with permission. Elia opened her notebook after a while. She wrote 3 lines, then stopped. The words came out like breath, and once they were on the page, they no longer needed to circle her mind. She closed the notebook again, and the relief was immediate. Not joy, not happiness, just space. Somewhere a shelf made a faint sound, wood responding to humidity. The ventilation hummed. The library remained. Elia's gaze drifted toward the windows. Raindrops gathered there, small and indistinct in the dark. catching the light only when they slid downward at the right angle. The motion was slow, patient, no urgency, no destination. She watched without thinking. A quiet footstep approached, not loud, not sudden, just close enough to register. Elia turned her head slightly and saw Nora standing near her table with 2 mugs on a small tray. Steam rose in a thin ribbon from both. Nora's voice was low, as if speaking louder would make the room shrink. "Is chamomile still all right?" Elia blinked once, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." Nora placed the mug down within easy reach, then set the other in front of the empty chair opposite. She didn't sit immediately. She paused, letting Elia decide whether company was welcome. Elia wasn't sure what she wanted, but she knew what she didn't want. She didn't want to be alone with her thoughts in a bedroom where everything felt too close and too silent. So she lifted her eyes to Nora and gave a small, honest nod. Nora sat. The chair made the same faint complaint and then went quiet. They held the silence together for a while. Not awkward, not tense, just present. Elia wrapped her hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into her palms, and from there, into her wrists, her arms, her chest. She took a slow sip. The taste was simple and gentle. Nora watched her, not staring, not inspecting, just paying attention in the way someone pays attention when they're not planning what to say next. Elia didn't realize how rare that was until she felt it. Nora spoke first, but softly, like a thought that didn't need to be defended. "You look a little pulled thin." Elia's mouth curved, faint and tired. "I didn't sleep." Nora didn't react with concern or solutions. No questions about routines, no suggestions about breathing exercises. Just a quiet acceptance of the statement. "I'm sorry," Nora said, and the words sounded like what they were. Compassion, not pity. Elia swallowed, her gaze dropping to the mug. "It's not." She stopped. The instinct to minimize it rose automatically, and she hated that it was automatic. Nora waited. The library waited. Elia tried again. "It happens. Sometimes more than sometimes." Nora nodded once. "That's why you come here." It wasn't a question. Elia's fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "Yes." Nora's hands rested around her own mug, not lifting it yet. "Does it help?" Elia thought about it, not as a polite answer, but as something she could actually feel. "Yes," she said quietly. "Not always immediately, but my body stops fighting." Nora's eyes softened. "Good." Elia looked at her then, more directly. Nora had a calm face, but not blank. There was something careful in her expression, a deliberate gentleness that suggested she knew exactly how sharp the world could be, and had chosen not to become sharp in return. Elia's chest tightened in a way that wasn't unpleasant. She looked away again, as if her eyes had touched something warm and didn't want to burn it. They sat in silence again, longer this time. The building's small sounds filled the space between them. A faint hum, a distant settling of wood, the softest swish of paper. Elia noticed how easy it was to breathe here when she didn't have to perform being fine. She did not realize she had been performing until the performance stopped. Nora spoke again, a little later, in a tone that suggested she was not fishing for intimacy, only offering it if it was wanted. "Do you want a book tonight?" Nora asked. "Or just the room?" Elia blinked. The question was so simple, and yet it made her feel understood in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't know," Elia admitted. Nora nodded, as if that answer was complete. "That's okay." She stood, quietly, and moved toward the nearest shelves. Elia watched without meaning to. Nora's movements were unhurried, her hands light on the spines as she passed, not searching desperately, not hunting for something impressive, just wandering the way someone wanders when they belong somewhere. Nora stopped near a shelf Elia hadn't explored much. Older bindings, titles worn at the edges. She pulled out a book and carried it back. She didn't slide it across the table like a librarian delivering a recommendation. She placed it down gently, like offering a warm object. "It's short," Nora said, "and it doesn't demand anything. It's mostly atmosphere, the kind you can drift through." Elia touched the cover with one fingertip. It was textured, slightly rough, comforting in a physical way. "You've read it?" Nora smiled. "More than once." Elia hesitated. "Why?" Nora's expression didn't tighten. She didn't look away. Her voice stayed even. "Because it helps me remember," she said softly, "that not everything has to be solved to be bearable." Elia felt that sentence settle into her chest, like something that belonged there. She opened the book. The first paragraph was simple. The language unforced, calm. Elia read slowly, not to finish, but to let her mind have something gentle to hold. Nora remained seated across from her, sipping tea in small, quiet intervals. Elia read for a while, the words moving like water. At some point, she realized she had stopped thinking about herself. Not entirely, but enough. Her shoulders lowered. Her fingers loosened on the page. The inner monologue that usually ran behind everything, commentary, critique, planning, grew quieter. It didn't disappear. It simply stopped shouting. Elia kept reading. Nora did not interrupt. The library did not interrupt. The night outside pressed against the windows and stayed there. After some time, Elia closed the book and held her place with a finger. Nora looked up, attentive. Elia didn't know why she spoke next. Maybe because the room felt like it could hold what she said without distorting it. "When I'm awake at night," Elia said quietly, "I don't feel scared." Nora waited, and the waiting was kind. Elia continued, "It's not panic. It's not fear. It's like my brain refuses to be off duty." She paused. The words didn't feel perfect, but they were close enough. Like, if I stop paying attention, something will slip and I'll miss it. Nora's gaze didn't sharpen with curiosity. It stayed soft. "Miss what?" she asked gently. Elia's throat tightened. She stared at the book in front of her like it had answers printed on the page. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's the stupid part." Nora's mouth curved slightly, but not in amusement at Elia. More like recognition of the human condition. "It's not stupid," Nora said. "It's just exhausting." Elia let out a slow breath, the kind that came from somewhere lower than lungs. "Yes," she whispered. Nora shifted slightly, her hand moving on the table. She didn't reach for Elia. She didn't invade the space. She simply rested her palm near her own mug, steady, open. Elia noticed the gesture anyway, a quiet invitation that didn't demand acceptance. It made something inside Elia soften. She didn't know what to do with that softness, so she let it exist without action. Silence returned, but it wasn't a withdrawal. It felt like a blanket resettling. Elia looked back at the open book, but her eyes no longer wanted the words. Her body wanted stillness. Nora watched her carefully and spoke in a tone so low it almost blended with the room. "There's a reading nook," Nora said. "Behind that shelf, it's darker, softer chairs, a blanket, if you want it." Elia looked up. "For staff," Nora shook her head. "For anyone who needs it. People used to come in the evenings and fall asleep with a book open on their chest. The city tried to stop it once. But," she paused, her eyes warm, "the library has always been a little stubborn." Elia's lips parted, surprised by how much she liked that. The library being stubborn on behalf of tired people. Nora stood and gestured softly. Not an order, not a push, an option. Elia closed the book carefully, holding her place with the same finger. She stood as well, moving slowly, as if her body had forgotten how to rush. They walked together, steps muffled by carpet. Elia noticed little things as they moved. A lamp with a soft shade, its light angled down to avoid glare. A a small table with a bowl of wrapped mints, the edges of worn rugs that had been stepped on by countless feet. The library felt like a place that had been used kindly. They reached a narrow passage between shelves that opened into a small nook. It was simple. A deep armchair with a faded cushion, a second chair beside it, smaller, a side table, a lamp, a folded blanket draped neatly over the armrest, and beyond, a window, tall enough to show the darkness and the slow rain on the glass. Nora didn't turn it into a ceremony. She simply lifted the blanket and placed it lightly over the armchair. Elia stood in the doorway of the nook, feeling something unfamiliar. Permission to stop, to be held by furniture and light and quiet without earning it. She sat carefully in the armchair. The cushion accepted her weight. She adjusted the blanket over her lap, the fabric soft against her hands. Nora sat in the smaller chair, angled slightly toward Elia, but not facing her directly. A posture that said, present, not pressing. Elia opened the book again, but she didn't read right away. She held it in her lap, fingers resting on the cover. Nora's voice was soft, almost casual. If you fall asleep, it's fine. Elia's throat tightened. She wanted to make a joke. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to be competent. Instead, she only nodded. Nora added, even more quietly, "Nothing here expects you to stay awake." The sentence landed gently and broke something open inside Elia. Not in a painful way, but in a release. Elia looked toward the window. The rain drew thin lines down the glass, catching lamplight in brief, muted glimmers. The room was warm. The blanket was heavy in a comforting way. The chair held her like an understanding hand. Nora remained beside her, still enough to feel safe. Elia opened the book and began to read. The words moved slowly through her mind, not clinging, not scraping, just passing through. She read a paragraph, then another. She didn't push for comprehension. She let the sentences exist. Her eyelids grew heavier, not suddenly but naturally. She blinked and found herself rereading the same line. She blinked again and realized the line no longer mattered. The thought that usually followed, "You should try harder," did not arrive. The library didn't require effort. The chair didn't require effort. Nora didn't require effort. Elia's breathing slowed. She held the book lightly now, the way someone holds something they trust not to fall. She didn't know exactly when the shift happened, only that at some point the room softened at the edges, and her body began to surrender to gravity in a deeper way. Nora spoke once more, very softly, more to the room than to Elia. "I'll be here." Elia didn't answer. Her mouth was too tired for words, and she didn't need them. Her eyes closed, not in defeat, in relief. The book rested against her chest, warm from her hands. The blanket covered her legs. The lamp cast a steady glow. Rain continued its gentle work on the window. Nora stayed in the smaller chair, a quiet presence in the corner of the room, reading her own book with slow patience. The library held them both, and for the first time in what felt like too long, Elia slept. Not perfectly, not deeply at first, but enough. Enough to remind her body what it felt like to let go without being punished for it. Elia woke the way she had been waking lately, slowly, without panic. There was no sharp return to herself, no instant inventory of what had gone wrong. Just the gradual awareness of warmth, weight, and quiet. The blanket still covered her legs. The book rested against her chest, slightly tilted, its pages fanned open where her fingers had slipped free. Her mouth tasted faintly of chamomile. The light in the nook had changed. The lamp still glowed, but softer now, as if it had been dimmed by time rather than by a switch. Beyond the window, the rain had thinned into something gentler. Fine streaks sliding down the glass in patient lines. The night outside remained, but it no longer felt like a wall pressing inward. It felt like a wide, dark space that could hold things without swallowing them. Elia stayed still for a moment, letting herself notice the details without turning them into thoughts. Then she remembered. Nora. Her gaze shifted, careful, as if moving too quickly might crack the quiet. Nora was still in the smaller chair, curled slightly into herself, a book open in her lap. Her head had tilted to one side, resting against the back cushion. A strand of hair had escaped and fallen across her cheek. One hand still held the page, but loosely, as if even sleep had been gentle with her. She looked younger like this, not in a childish way, just unguarded, unarranged, less like a person performing calm and more like someone who truly belonged inside it. Elia watched her for a few seconds longer than she meant to. Not because she was studying her, because her body recognized safety and didn't want to look away. Nora stirred. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift in her shoulders, a slow breath, the smallest movement of her fingers on the page. Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first. Then her gaze found Elia. There was a pause where neither of them spoke. The air between them didn't fill with awkwardness. It filled with something else, something tender and slightly new, like the first warmth of water after stepping in from cold air. Nora's voice was low and soft from sleep. "You slept?" Elia swallowed, as if admitting it out loud might make it less true. "I did." Nora's mouth curved faintly. "Good." Elia felt something loosen again. Not dramatic, just enough. Nora blinked a few times, waking fully. She closed her book gently, like she didn't want to startle the night. Then she glanced at Elia's book, still open on her chest. "You didn't even drop it," Nora murmured. Elia glanced down, surprised by how much she cared about that detail. "I guess I was committed." "Or comfortable," Nora said, and the way she said it wasn't teasing. It was careful, as if she was naming something precious without trying to claim it. Elia's throat tightened, the familiar reflex to deflect rising immediately. She didn't. She just nodded once. "Yeah." Nora sat forward slightly, setting her book on the side table. "Do you want water?" Elia considered her own body, as if checking whether thirst existed. Maybe. Nora stood quietly and moved out of the nook. Elia watched her go, noticing the soft, unhurried way Nora walked, as if even leaving the space was done gently. Left alone for a moment, Elia became aware of the oddness of what had happened. She had fallen asleep in a library, not at home, not in her bed, not behind a locked door, and yet she had slept. It wasn't the kind of sleep that erased everything. It didn't solve the night. But it had been real enough to change the inside of her chest, the way a deep breath changes the body even after it's over. When Nora returned, she carried a small glass of water and placed it on the side table within easy reach. She didn't lean over Elia. She didn't hover. She simply set it down and sat again. Elia pushed herself upright slowly, the blanket sliding down her legs. She closed the book carefully and held it for a second before placing it on her lap, like she didn't want to lose the feeling of it. She reached for the water, took a few sips. Nora watched her without pressure. After a while, Nora spoke again, voice even. "You can stay here as long as you want." Elia's fingers tightened around the glass. "Is that allowed?" Nora's expression warmed. "This place is older than most rules. It's had time to decide what matters." Elia huffed a small laugh, quiet, surprised. "That's a very librarian answer." Nora's eyes softened. "I'm only a librarian at night." "What are you during the day?" Elia asked before she could stop herself. Nora hesitated. Just a breath. Then she answered simply, "Someone who sleeps." The honesty made Elia's chest ache in a strange, gentle way. She nodded, as if that made sense. It did. They sat for a while without speaking, the silence returning like a familiar blanket. Elia looked toward the window again. The rain had become a thin, constant whisper. The city beyond remained quiet, as if it was also trying not to wake itself. Elia realized something else then, something uncomfortable, but not unbearable. She didn't want to leave. Not because she needed the library, because she didn't want this, whatever this was, between her and Nora to end. The thought arrived clean and clear, without drama. Elia turned her head slowly. Do you ever get lonely here? Nora's gaze flicked to her, surprised by the question. Then Nora looked down at her hands, as if deciding how honest to be. Yes, she said quietly. Sometimes. But it's a gentle kind of lonely. Ilya frowned slightly. How can lonely be gentle? Nora's lips curved faintly. Because it doesn't come with rejection. It's just space. Ilya absorbed that. Space. Not absence. Not punishment. Just room. Nora looked up again. Do you feel lonely? Elia's first instinct was to say no. To say she was fine. To say she was busy. To say she didn't need anything. But she was too tired for that kind of lie. Yes, Ilya admitted, but mine doesn't feel gentle. Nora's expression shifted, softer and more serious. What does it feel like? Ilya stared at the book in her lap, as if the answer might be written there. Like, I'm always doing something to avoid hearing myself. Nora didn't interrupt. Ilya continued, voice low. And when I finally stop, it's too loud. Nora's breath came out slowly. That makes sense. Ilya looked at her, a flicker of skepticism passing through her. Does it? Nora nodded. Yes, it does. No advice, no fixing, just understanding. Ilya swallowed. She wasn't used to being believed without needing to prove her pain was legitimate. The air between them settled into something quieter, deeper. Then Nora stood again, and Ilya felt the brief pinch of fear that Nora was leaving, that the moment was ending. But Nora only stepped to the lamp and adjusted it slightly, turning it lower, making the light softer. A small gesture that transformed the room from awake to resting. She sat back down. Ilya watched the movement and felt an unexpected warmth behind her ribs. Nora did things like that, quietly, without making them about herself. Ilya said, You do that a lot. Nora looked at her. Do what? Make things easier, Ilya replied, and hated how exposed it sounded. Nora didn't flinch. I try. Why? Ilya asked. The question hung in the air, heavier than the others. It wasn't a demand. It was curiosity edged with vulnerability. Nora's gaze stayed on Ilya's face. Because the world is already hard, she said softly. And because I know what it feels like to be awake when you don't want to be. Ilya's throat tightened again, that familiar ache that came when someone said something true. Nora added, even more quietly, and because you look like you've been carrying too much by yourself. Ilya's chest warmed and ached all at once. She looked away, blinking slowly. I don't know how to stop. Nora's voice stayed steady. You don't have to stop all at once. Ilya turned back. Then how? Nora hesitated, then spoke carefully, as if she didn't want to promise something she couldn't deliver. You start by letting someone sit nearby, not to fix it, just to share the room. Ilya's hands clenched lightly around the blanket's edge. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she stayed, and staying, Ilya realized, was already an answer. They moved out of the nook a while later, not because they needed to, but because the library space invited wandering. Nora led Ilya through the stacks with slow steps, pointing out corners Ilya hadn't noticed before, a shelf of old travel journals with handwriting pressed into yellowed paper, a section of poetry that smelled faintly like lavender, as if someone had once stored sachets between the pages, a narrow row where the carpet became thicker, muffling footsteps into near silence. Ilya didn't ask why Nora knew these details. She didn't need to. Nora stopped near a shelf and reached for a book, then paused, her hand hovering. Ilya watched the movement, the hesitation, and something in her shifted. Nora wasn't simply calm. Nora was choosing calm. Choosing softness over and over. It was not effortless. That made it feel more real. Nora pulled out the book and held it out. This one is quiet. Elia took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. It was barely a touch, skin against skin for less than a second. But Elia felt it like a small spark under water, muted, warm, undeniable. Nora's gaze flicked to Elia's hand where it held the book, then back to Elia's face. There was something careful in Nora's eyes, as if she was asking a question without words. Elia's body answered before her mind could. She didn't pull away. She didn't move closer either, but she stayed exactly where she was, allowing the space between them to exist without fear. Nora exhaled softly, almost a relief, and looked down as if to give Elia privacy in her own reaction. Elia wanted to say something light, something normal, but the truth was quieter than language. So instead she opened the book and began to read aloud, just one sentence softly, testing the sound of her voice in the room. The words didn't echo, they settled. Nora listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her hands loosely folded in front of her. Elia read another line, then another. She wasn't performing. She wasn't acting. She was simply letting language exist between them, the way tea existed, the way light existed. When she stopped, the silence returned, and this time it felt intimate rather than empty. Nora spoke just as quietly as Elia had read. "You have a soothing voice." Elia blinked, caught off guard. "I do not." Nora smiled slightly. "You do." Elia's cheeks warmed in a way she wasn't prepared for. Compliments usually felt like pressure, like expectations. This one felt like an observation. It made her want to breathe deeper. She looked down at the book. "It's probably just the room." Nora's eyes softened. "The room doesn't do everything." Elia's throat tightened again. She was so tired of defending herself from tenderness. She let the silence answer for her. Later they returned to the nook. Nora dimmed the lamp again without comment. Elia sat in the armchair, blanket over her lap. Nora took the smaller chair, angled beside her. Elia opened the quiet book Nora had given her and read for a while, not loudly, not fully aloud, just under her breath, as if sharing the sound with the room. Her eyelids grew heavier again, but this time sleep didn't feel like a fragile visitor. It felt closer, more willing. Elia stopped reading and rested the book on her lap. Nora looked over. "Tired?" Elia nodded. "Honest, yes." Nora's voice was barely above silence. "You can sleep." Elia's fingers tightened briefly on the book's cover. "And you?" Nora's mouth curved faintly. "I'll be here." Elia hesitated. Then, with a small movement that felt enormous, she shifted in the chair, making room, not for Nora to sit in her lap, not for anything dramatic, but for closeness. Nora didn't move. She waited. Elia took a slow breath, then said quietly, "Could you sit closer?" The words were simple. They shook something loose in Elia's chest. Nora's eyes softened in a way that made Elia look away for a second, overwhelmed by the gentleness of being answered without negotiation. Nora stood and moved her chair closer, just a little, enough that their knees were almost aligned, that their warmth could be felt if the air shifted. Nora sat again. Elia's breathing slowed, her body responding immediately to the reduced distance. Nora didn't touch her. That was what made it safe. Nora's presence filled the space like warmth fills a room, quietly, without taking anything. Elia closed her eyes. Her thoughts still moved faintly, but they no longer felt like they needed to be chased. The room held them. Nora held the room. Elia's muscles loosened. Her fingers relaxed. And somewhere, in the soft dark behind her eyelids, Sleep came closer, patient, unhurried, unthreatening. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in a long time, Elia wasn't alone with herself. When the morning eventually arrived, it did not do so loudly. It began as a slight paling of the window, a subtle change in the tone of the darkness. Elia didn't wake immediately. She stayed in that in-between state, warm under the blanket, aware of Nora's quiet presence nearby. Nora's voice came softly, like a thread of sound. Elia. Elia opened her eyes slowly. Nora was watching her, with that same calm expression, but there was something new there, tenderness edged with a quiet kind of protectiveness. Elia's voice was rough with sleep. "What time is it?" Nora's smile was faint. "Early." Elia sat up slightly, blinking. I fell asleep again." Nora nodded. "You did." Elia looked down at herself, as if expecting to find shame there. But there was none, only warmth, and the quiet proof that her body could rest. She looked back up at Nora. "Thank you." Nora's expression softened further. "For what?" Elia searched for the simplest truth. "For being steady." Nora's gaze held hers. "You did the sleeping," she said softly. "I just stayed." Elia's chest tightened again. She wanted to say something that made sense of it. Instead, she let herself be quiet. Nora stood slowly. "I should check the front," she said, voice gentle. "But you can stay here as long as you need. No rush." Elia nodded, and Nora turned to go. Halfway out of the nook, Nora paused, as if hearing something without sound. She glanced back. Elia met her eyes. There was a moment where both of them seemed to understand that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not irrevocably, but enough to matter. Nora spoke softly, almost like a promise that wasn't trying to be a promise. "I'll be back." Elia's voice was quiet. "Okay." Nora left. Elia remained in the armchair, blanket over her lap, the book warm against her thigh, the window slowly lightening in front of her. The library felt the same, and yet Elia didn't. Something inside her had begun to believe in rest again. Not as an accident, as a possibility. The library did not change abruptly when the night deepened. There was no signal to announce it, no clear boundary between late and very late. The shift happened the way sleep often did, quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly the world felt softer around the edges. Elia remained in the armchair long after the moment she might normally have stood and apologized for taking up space. The chair held her weight without complaint. The blanket rested over her legs, warm but not heavy. The book lay closed now, its presence familiar enough that it no longer asked to be read. Across from her, Nora sat in the smaller chair, angled slightly toward the window. She wasn't reading anymore. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, fingers relaxed, her attention not fixed on anything in particular. They shared the room without needing to acknowledge it. This was new, not the being together part. Elia had been around people her whole life. But this particular arrangement, this quiet coexistence without expectation, felt unfamiliar enough that her body kept checking to see if it was allowed. Nothing told her it wasn't. The rain outside had thinned again, leaving only faint streaks on the glass that caught the light when they moved. The city beyond remained distant, blurred into suggestion rather than detail. Elia shifted slightly in the chair, adjusting the blanket. The movement drew Nora's attention, but only briefly. Nora looked over, met Elia's eyes for a moment, then looked away again. An acknowledgement without pressure. Elia exhaled. She hadn't realized how often she held her breath around other people. Time passed. Not measured, not tracked. Just allowed. At some point, Elia became aware that her thoughts had slowed in a different way than before. Not because she was tired, though she was. Not because she was distracted, but because there was nothing in the room that required her to be alert. Her mind drifted without latching onto anything sharp. Images came and went without demanding interpretation. The usual internal commentary, the running assessment of how she was doing, how she was being perceived, quieted to a low murmur and then receded. She rested her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to stop looking. Nora noticed but did not comment. The lamp beside them continued to glow steadily. The light was low enough that shadows gathered in the corners of the nook, but not so low that the space felt uncertain. It was the kind of light meant to stay, not to perform. Elia's breathing deepened. She felt the weight of her body more clearly now. The press of the chair against her back, the warmth at her calves, the gentle pull of gravity in her shoulders. She thought, briefly, about how rare it was to be somewhere that did not ask her to be better. No productivity, no insight, no transformation, just rest. She opened her eyes again, slowly, and found Nora watching the window. Elia spoke without fully deciding to. "Do you ever get tired of the quiet?" Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes," she said, "but not in the way people usually mean." Elia turned her head slightly. "How do you mean it?" Nora's voice stayed low. "Sometimes I miss noise that belongs to me, laughter, music, conversations that don't have to be careful." Elia absorbed that. "But you choose this anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Nora didn't answer immediately. The pause felt intentional, not evasive. "Because this quiet feels honest," Nora said finally. "It doesn't pretend to be anything else." Elia nodded. That made sense in a way that didn't need elaboration. They fell silent again. The night continued to loosen its grip on the room. Not enough to call it morning, just enough to feel the direction of time shifting. Elia felt drowsy again, not suddenly, not overwhelmingly, just a gentle heaviness returning to her limbs. She shifted in the chair, then paused, uncertain. Nora noticed immediately. "You can sleep again," Nora said softly. "You don't need to decide anything." Elia hesitated. "What if I don't?" Nora's expression softened. "Then you don't." Elia studied her face, looking for expectation, impatience, disappointment. There was none. She let herself sink back into the chair. This time, sleep came closer without resistance. It hovered at the edges of her awareness, not pulling her under, just waiting. Elia's eyes closed. She slept in fragments, short, shallow stretches that blurred into one another. She was aware, dimly, of the room around her, the steady light, the muted sounds, Nora's presence like a constant point of warmth nearby. At one point, she stirred slightly, her head tilting to one side. She didn't open her eyes, but she sensed movement. Nora had stood, not abruptly, carefully, as if trying not to disturb the air itself. Elia felt the blanket shift, adjusted more securely around her legs. The motion was gentle, precise. Nora did not touch her directly, only the fabric, but the care in the action registered all the same. Elia's body responded by relaxing further. She drifted again. When she woke next, the quality of the light had changed. It was still night technically, but the darkness no longer felt complete. The window held a muted gray-blue glow, subtle enough that it didn't announce itself as morning, but unmistakable in its promise. Elia sat up slowly. Her body felt different now, not energized, not restored, but steadier. She became aware of Nora standing near the window, hands resting lightly on the sill, looking out at the street below. Her posture was relaxed, unguarded. Elia watched her for a moment, struck by how natural it felt to witness someone else's quiet without feeling intrusive. Nora sensed her gaze and turned. Their eyes met. Neither smiled immediately. The moment didn't need decoration. "Did I wake you?" Nora asked quietly. Elia shook her head. "No, I think I was already coming back." Nora nodded. "Me too." They shared a small smile then, not bright, not playful, just real. Elia stood, the chair releasing her reluctantly. She folded the blanket again, slower this time, smoothing it with care. She didn't want to rush the ritual away. They walked together out of the nook, their steps unhurried. The main space of the library looked different now. The lamps were still on, but daylight had begun to mingle with them, softening the contrast. The shelves looked less mysterious, but no less comforting. Elia paused near one of the tall windows. "I should probably go home," she said, not as a question. Nora nodded. Yes. There was no tension in the agreement, no fear that leaving meant losing something. Elia gathered her bag and coat. At the entrance, she stopped. She turned to Nora, her fingers tightening briefly around the strap of her bag. "I don't know how tonight fits into my life," Elia said quietly. Nora met her gaze. "You don't have to." Elia exhaled. "I'm not good at things that don't fit." Nora's expression remained calm. "You don't have to make it fit. You can just let it exist." Elia considered that. Then she nodded. "I'd like to come back," she said. "Not every night. Not out of need. Just sometimes." Nora smiled, gentle and unassuming. "I'll be here." The words were simple. They carried no promise beyond themselves, and that made them trustworthy. Elia opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool, the street quiet. The city felt suspended between night and day, neither fully asleep nor fully awake. She walked slowly, her pace unhurried. When she reached home later and lay down, she didn't force sleep. She didn't bargain with it. She simply rested. And when sleep came, eventually, gently, it felt less like surrender and more like agreement, as if her body had learned, at last, that rest did not have to be earned. It could simply be accepted. And somewhere, behind her closed eyes, the library continued to exist. Steady, patient, open, holding space for quiet nights that did not demand resolution. Only presence, only time, only the slow, untroubled unfolding of rest.